You're listening to Soundside. I'm Paige Browning. The nation is still reckoning with a Supreme Court decision last week that critics say renders a key aspect of the Voting Rights Act useless. The court ruled that Louisiana illegally used race in the way it drew its district map. The decision has wider implications for how all such maps are drawn. Some states, including Florida, have already moved to change their maps. This is all happening mere months before the midterm elections. Let's talk more about the ruling now with one of the country's most prominent voting rights activists, Stacey Abrams. In 2018, she was the first Black woman ever nominated for governor by a major party when she ran for governor in Georgia. She's speaking at Town Hall Seattle next Thursday, May 14th, in a conversation presented by the Endowment for Equal Justice. Stacey Abrams, welcome to Soundside. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Last week, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 to strike down a congressional map in Louisiana. You have called that ruling a direct hit to the fragile promise that every American's vote should carry equal weight. You and many voting rights advocates say it's because the decision weakens the Voting Rights Act. How does it do that?
The Voting Rights Act was necessary in 1965 in order to make real the promise of the 15th Amendment. Most of us know the 13th Amendment ended slavery. For most, that the 14th Amendment guaranteed birthright citizenship for now. But the 15th Amendment said that you could not prohibit or interfere with the right to vote based on race, color, or creed. And in the South, that was met with the Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws essentially said that they were going to put hurdles in place to make certain that the right to vote for African Americans was never made manifest. And it took 150 years. It took until 1965 for the Voting Rights Act to say that this was not simply a theory, that the federal government and the states had to abide by the 15th Amendment. And it gave the responsibility to the federal government to hold states accountable. Within the Voting Rights Act, there were multiple provisions. Section 5, which said you have to ask permission before you make voting harder. Unfortunately, that was gutted in 2013 through the Shelby decision. But Section 2 said, in addition, we know that you stopped people from voting by not letting them register or show up at the polls, but you also did it by drawing lines at the district level that essentially guaranteed they could never elect anyone who shared their values or would reflect their needs. And in the South in particular, but nationwide, race is the strongest predictor of political leanings. And so the Congress in 1982 explicitly said that race had to be a consideration when drawing lines, particularly for the benefit of minority communities. Because when you're in the minority, if you are dispersed or if you are packed, you are not permitted to actually have an effect on the outcome of elections. And so the maps had to be drawn to reflect the racial composition, because it is both hypocritical and intentionally problematic to ignore race as a factor. And so it was working. We saw more and more communities able to physically use the lines drawn to actively participate in elections. And what the court said last week is that, oops, never mind. It was working not exceptionally well, but better than we like, and we are now removing it.
And the court, as you're referencing, their ruling last week, Justice Samuel Alito said that the focus of the Voting Rights Act should be intentional racial discrimination, and that in his words, vast social change in the South meant majority non-white congressional districts were not necessary anymore. Your response?
That his intention is to pretend that racial injustice does not continue to exist in America. But his legal standard is now that rather than using a detective to determine what's happened, you now have to have a psychic to know why it happened. And that's problematic because we know that voter suppression has been on the rise across the South. We know that in Texas, they intentionally and explicitly redrew the lines last year to diminish the voting power of Latino and Black voters. That in Florida, they intentionally drew the lines to reduce the voting power of Black and Latino voters. In North Carolina, and in Louisiana explicitly. Their anger was because Black voters now had an opportunity to select two members of Congress. It is disingenuous to suggest that race does not matter in America, and it is ahistorical to pretend that it does not matter in American elections. We know it does, and we know it continues to be problematic. And Justice Alito is being deeply disingenuous, and I would say his racist behavior is going to harm not just the people he's targeting, but American democracy writ large.
So I'm here in Washington State, in Seattle. Help me understand why this matters. This is a case in Louisiana, why this matters all the way up here. You wrote that once such horrible maps are in place, reversing them is extraordinarily difficult. Can you tell us why?
Sure. We live in a country of 50 states, and we have determined that we have bound ourselves in outcome, which means that part of the congressional makeup has to reflect the needs of all Americans. When minority populations are isolated from power, it has an effect upstream, but also across the country. That means extremist legislation becomes easier to pass. It becomes easier to rig maps everywhere else, and it limits accountability across the country. Often the challenges start in the South, but we are both an incubator, but we are also a carrier. And what happens is what starts in the South tends to move across the country. We have to fight for the whole map because we have to fight for the entire country. This is not a Southern problem alone. The erosion of voting rights affects communities across the country. And when we diminish full participation in our voting, we diminish the pluralism of our democracy. And so I would urge anyone, irrespective of where you live, to be deeply concerned when your fellow citizens are told their votes do not matter and when politicians are allowed to draw the lines to cherry pick their voters.
And a quick question to follow that on what a map based on the ruling would look like. Would they be blocks of geography?
It would actually gut the members of Congress who currently represent communities of color. So right now you have 67 members in the Congressional Black Caucus, and that has taken 60 years to achieve. Now let's remember, Congress is 435 members in the House. There are only 67 Black members, 65, I think 64 in the House itself. Under the new ruling, we know that up to 20 of those, 19 of those seats could be eviscerated. The Latino caucus could lose 5 seats. And then across the country at the state legislative level, the state legislators who draw those congressional maps could see 191 members lose their seats. That means that if you care about affordable housing, if you care about healthcare, if you have any concerns about social justice in this country, if we lose those members of Congress, we also lose those values being represented in Congress. That's the problem for every American, that we're not just losing seats, we are losing political power for there being a debate in Congress about what's possible.
To pivot a little bit, after establishing a national profile following your runs for Georgia governor in 2018 and 2022, you seem to have stepped back from the spotlight. Why?
Well, I would say this. When you're running for governor, especially when you have a candidacy like mine, which was unusual since I was the first Black woman in American history to stand for that, to make it that far in standing for that office, the spotlight goes where it wants, but the work remains. And while the spotlight may have shifted, I have not stopped doing the work. I founded Fair Fight to fight for voting rights. I founded Fair Count to fight for a census that fairly reflects America. I founded the American Pride Rises Network to defend diversity, equity, and inclusion. I recently launched the 10 Steps campaign to fight back against the authoritarian regime that is trying to strip us of our democracy. And to bring it back to the KUOW decision, that is a pillar of doing so. Because when you can reshape Congress without having to actually compete in the valley of ideas, what you accomplish is a step towards what Viktor Orban did in Hungary and what Russia does every day with its Duma. When you can create any opportunity to limit the voice of the people, you are eroding democracy. And so while The attention may have shifted. The work has never stopped.
You stayed busy, that's for sure. So, just a couple of questions on electoral politics. When you look back on the Democratic race for president in 2024, what is the biggest thing you wish the party had done differently?
I think it's less about party and more about the people. We give parties a lot of authority, or at least we imbue them with power, and necessarily so. It's an easier thing to do. But I want us to remember that the decision that came out of 24 was by fewer than 2 million people,
Mm-hmm.
but 90 million people did not vote. And so, what I call on every Democratic member of this country to do, anyone who considers themselves to be aligned with democratic values, is to remind people about how those values get connected to the people we elect. I can't, we can't go back in time and change the election, but what we can do is look forward and make certain that we connect democracy to people's lived experiences. Democracy has to deliver, and that means Democrats have to deliver.
Democrats are often criticized for at least a perceived lack of values, for being kind of milquetoast, poll tested, boilerplate candidates, reciting the party line, and that's part of why they're not winning. What do you make of that critique?
I would also remind folks that over the last 20 years, we have basically held power almost as often as the other side has.
Hmm.
The issue is, what do we do with that power when we have it? And that's why I am so bullish about voting rights. They borrow our power. Elected officials borrow power, but the people have to remember that it is borrowed and we can take it back. Democrats have values. We believe in shared success. We believe that everyone has the right to do their best, but that we should remove barriers. The right has a similar set of conditionalities, but they have a different composition. We are the most diverse party, which means we've got to try to meet the needs of a broader coalition. But we can meet those needs by understanding and recognizing that identity matters and outcome matters. And if we are working on both of those things, fighting for a voting rights act that actually guarantees that your identity does not diminish your access to democracy, but also delivering on affordability, delivering on the needs of the people to make progress possible in their lives, that's how Democrats win.
Stacey Abrams, what would you say to someone who thinks, I haven't been able to individually vote the U.S. out of an extremely unpopular war with Iran. My vote has not guaranteed my prices are going down. The structure of the Senate means that voters in more populous states have more diluted power. My producer and I are hearing our friends and colleagues say, it's just hard to even watch the news. You want to turn it off. What do you tell them when you ask them to lock in?
Because that's the point of what they're doing. The reason we have seen this aggressive destruction of our democracy is to create the sense that we can't do a thing about it. And I point to Hungary very intentionally. For 16 years, Viktor Orban ruled a country that had emerged from communist rule in 1989, had finally come close to a functioning democracy. And then you had Viktor Orban, who Donald Trump and J.D. Vance have lauded. This is a man who attacked the media and basically took control of public media. He attacked the legislature and basically reshifted it and reshaped it so that only his party could be heard. He attacked the judiciary and made them a puppet. He did all of the things we are watching happen in America. But what happened 2 weeks ago in Hungary was that 78% of the population said no more. They said after 16 years of watching their prices go up and their values be crushed, watching corruption run amok, they were refusing to do it any longer. And it worked. They not only removed him as the president, they flipped both chambers. They changed the composition of their legislature, and now they are on the path to restoring full and participatory democracy, which is how we get the things we need. I am the daughter of the South. My parents were born during Jim Crow. My parents weren't able to vote. My grandparents were in their 40s before they were full legal citizens of this country, even though they were born here. And so I know how slow and plodding and hard it can feel, but I also know how we can win because we've done it before. Every time we win, they come back and they try to take more power. We have to meet them on the battlefield of voting, on the battlefield of democracy, and believe more in our democracy than we believe in their right to deny it.
That is a powerful place to end. Stacey Abrams, lawyer and voting rights activist, she is the founder of American Pride Rises Network and the 10 Steps campaign. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And we want to note that Washington's Republican Party supports this ruling by the Supreme Court, and Party Chair Jim Walsh says that using race as the basis for drawing districts is unconstitutional. If you want to read the ruling, it'll be up on our website along with this interview at kuow.org/soundside.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime right here online at kuow.org, or of course on your favorite podcast app.